Hey film fans, the Sex Pistols on Disney? That can't be good. Hey film fans, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please make sure you hit the like button, and I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button. And if you want to do a little more, my Patreon page is in the description below. I've been doing a series about punk cinema over the last several weeks, and I've got several more entries in that series to go. While I was doing that series, or slightly before, but while I was planning it, Disney and in the US, Hulu released the limited or mini or short series Pistol about the life and times of the UK punk band, the Sex Pistols. And I have just recently finished watching the series. It was kind of on and off while I was doing other things over the summer. So I'm not going to do a full kind of deep dive review here like I've normally done, but since I just did a video about the Sex Pistols, in particular the two films about the Sex Pistols, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle from 1980 and The Filth and the Fury from 2000, both of which were directed by Julian Temple and both of which in different ways purport to tell the story of the Sex Pistols. And if you're interested, you can watch that here. Since I just posted that video a few days ago, I thought it might be worth saying a few things about how this series fits in with those films or doesn't. Can we learn anything new from it? And really, like, is it good? First off, like the elephant in the room, Sex Pistols on Disney. Now, Disney doesn't seem to have interfered that much. This is a film that's full of sex in a couple episodes, some pretty steamy sex. Obviously lots of foul language. You couldn't do a film about the Sex Pistols without it.
No one has said the word fuck on British TV ever before in history.
Brendan Behan.
What?
It's a matter of great pride to the Irish community in Britain that the first person to use the F word on British TV was, in fact, the poet Brendan Behan. He said fuck to Malcolm Muggeridge 10 times.
Some pretty serious violence, including self-inflicted violence and so on. This is an R-rated or close to sort of NC-17 rated series. That doesn't stop it from being corporate, which would seem to be the antithesis of a series about punk. Corporations have gotten clever in the last couple of decades about not meddling or appearing not to meddle, let's say. So when you watch Pistol, it's easy to forget this is a Hulu/Disney production. It's directed by Danny Boyle, the entire series. And Danny Boyle, I mean, he made Trainspotting. He's got punk bona fides, and he brings a lot of sort of verve and panache to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it looks good, it sounds good, the cast brings, you know, they really bring it for this. So it has a sort of patina of punk, for sure. It has a veneer of punk, but it is still very corporate, and it's very, in a lot of ways, sentimental, although it masks that sentiment really well. And maybe if you've watched my video on the Sex Pistols, you know I have some sentiment for these guys. Maybe you want that. Maybe you want something that pushes those buttons after watching especially something like The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which goes down the road of cynicism without sentiment much more directly and much more sort of full throttle. Anyway, I understand why, you know, any self-respecting punk rocker would say, like, fuck this. I'm not watching this corporate shill crap nothing burger. Fine. I don't think, if you know the story of the Sex Pistols, if you've watched the two movies that I did my video about, that you're necessarily going to learn anything new from this. You might learn a few things that aren't true. I'll come back to that as well. But you're not going to learn anything new. If you're just kind of getting into punk and you want to see the story of the Sex Pistols, you will learn a lot about the band and a lot about the times from this film. Be forewarned that it is fictionalized. I think the title card at the beginning of each episode says, I have it here, the following is inspired by actual events. The series is based on the book Lonely Boy by the guitar player Steve Jones. And it's very much Steve Jones's story, or Steve Jones's version of the story. He's kind of the protagonist, although Johnny Rotten, Paul Cook, Malcolm McLaren, Vivienne Westwood, in a wonderful performance and wonderfully written role, I think, Chrissie Hynde, they also figure in quite a bit, but it is kind of engineered to be Steve Jones's story. Having said that, it's also just the Sex Pistols story. So if you're new to the Sex Pistols, it's very entertaining and you will learn a lot about the band. But like I said before, warned, quite a bit of it is fictionalized. So if you want to know the facts, make sure there's a lot of stuff on the internet right now, like what does it get right and what does it get wrong. But watch The Filth and the Fury, compare them. Watch The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, compare them. It's a very entertaining series and you will learn a lot from it, but it's fiction at the end of the day and it's corporate. So if you're a punker, you might want to steer clear. But let's talk a little bit about what it gets right. First of all, it looks great. The production team has paid meticulous attention to period details, costume details, design details, and so on. So, I mean, first we have to give mad props to the work of, I'm gonna have to look this up, the cinematography by Anthony Dodd Mantle, the production design by Cave Quinn, and the costume design by Liza Bracey. It's phenomenal. They really capture the era, and from interviews I've read, they studied it very closely, not just by watching The Great Rock and Roll Swindle and The Filth and the Fury, which everybody seems to have done, but by looking at news footage from the era, from studying documentary photographs, and so on. The feeling that they get of London, mid-70s London, the interiors, the exteriors are fantastic. The costumes are great, and they pay really close attention to the details of the costumes. So, for example, if you look at the scene when the band signs their A&M contract, their second eventually failed contract before they moved to Virgin, which they did at Buckingham Palace. And this event is recounted in Swindle and in Filth and Fury, and again in Pistol. And here you can see an image of the event, and here you can see the costumes that they wear in the series. Similarly, you can see, here's a picture of them outside their tour bus on their tour of America. And here it is from the series. Here's Jordan, who I've talked a lot about because she's in Jubilee. And here's Maisie Williams, most famous probably for Game of Thrones, playing Jordan in the series. I mean, the makeup, the attention to detail is fantastic. The interior of Sex, the shop where a lot of this sprang from, fantastic. So you get this, it's a it's a great series to see. Whether it's great to watch is going to depend a lot on your approach to Disney Sex Pistols, but to look at it, it is fantastic, and they did an amazing job, and it really feels real. Having said that, I was a little thrown at first by some of the casting decisions, but that's my problem. That's a me problem. That's a culture problem. My favorite American Hollywood biopic is Bound for Glory. It's a 1976 film about Woody Guthrie, and Woody Guthrie is played by David Carradine. And David Carradine doesn't look like Woody Guthrie. He doesn't act like Woody Guthrie. He doesn't sing or sound like Woody Guthrie. And I have always felt like one of the strengths of that film is that by Carradine interpreting Guthrie, doing his version of Guthrie, it actually makes Guthrie's story more immediate and more accessible and more interesting than what the biopic has become today, which is really mimicry. But I have to confess that having seen I don't know how many biopics in the last 20 years, a lot, especially music biopics, that I have become used to that kind of mimicry, and I've become used to makeup and prosthetics that are used to turn a performer into their subject. And they don't do that in Pistol. The performers look like themselves. They act like Steve Jones and Johnny Rotten and Chrissie Hynde and so on, but they don't look like them. And that might throw you at first when Anson Boone shows up at the end of episode 1 and they announce, Johnny Rotten is coming. My first thought was, he doesn't look anything like Johnny Rotten.
Did you exchange?
So that's a little kind of barrier to entry for some people. Again, that's a me thing because Boone is awesome. He's really good. Toby Wallace as Steve Jones is really good. Again, he doesn't look a lot like Jones, but his performance is nasty and tough and savage and heartfelt and really wonderful. And top to bottom, I think the performances are really good. A couple other standouts are Thomas Brodie Sangster, who a lot of you again will know from Game of Thrones, and he plays Malcolm, and he does a wonderful job with a part that could have been very two-dimensional and very cliche. By this point in the Pistol story, and I talk about this a little bit in the video, has become the villain. And one of the things that Brodie Sangster really gets, and part of it, the part is really well written, but what he really gets is, in the early episodes, why the Pistols would have been so enamored with him and why they would have kind of come under his sway or fallen under his spell or whatever it is. He's very charismatic. He talks a great game, and the performance is very good. And as the series progresses, one of the things they do really well is transition from kind of guardian manager inspiration to manipulative, sort of anti-band villain is done quite gradually. It's always there, but it's done quite gradually. So by the end, when we have the fallout and the band realizes what was done to them, he's a real villain, but they do it really well and he performs it really well. The other great performance is Sidney Chandler, who plays Chrissie Hynde. And I always knew that Chrissie Hynde was around at this time. I'm a big fan of Chrissie Hynde. I love The Pretenders. So I don't know a lot about her history and her biography, but I always knew she was there. She shows up in pictures. If you look at old punk pictures from the 70s, there's Chrissie Hynde. Oh, there's Billy Idol. Oh, there's Sid Vicious before Sex Pistols, and so on. There's Adam Ant. And there's Chrissie Hynde again. She worked at Sex. The series makes it seem like she worked there for a long time, and apparently in real life it was kind of on and off, and she traveled around. She went to Paris in the middle of all this and things like that. But Chandler plays her really well. She brings this kind of wonderful sort of old soul depth to the performance while also still being young and naive. She doesn't want to come across as naive as she is, but she still is. And the way that she kind of falls for Jones despite herself is played really well. I think we're going to see more of her. She's a very magnanimous performer, but subtly so. And not everything about this series is subtle. So again, your mileage may vary, but the performances are great. Not all of the parts are incredibly well written. Talulah Riley does a great job, or as good a job as she can, playing Vivienne Westwood, but I don't think Westwood's part is. It's a little bit cliche, and in each episode, she seems to play the role that they need her to play in that episode. So sometimes she's a provocateur, sometimes she's like a raging feminist, ready for battle. Other times she's a protective mother who doesn't want her kids exposed to this. Other times she's got her kids silk screening Nazi swastikas onto t-shirts because they know that if we're going to bring down our idols, we also have to bring down our taboos. That's actually kind of a good scene. But and Westwood might have had all of that in her personality. People are complex. But because she's kind of a secondary character in the series, we don't see the transitions. We just see her, oh, well, here we need someone to do this, and she does it. And here we need someone to do this, so she does it. So the performance is quite good, but the characterization, the writing of it is kind of two-dimensional. Paul Cook is a little bit like that. He's kind of mopey throughout and a little bit two-dimensional. But for the most part, the performances are great. The other thing to say about the performances is that all of the performers sing and play their own instruments. There are a couple of interesting moments in the series when we see the real Sex Pistols on screen. But for the most part, it's all reenacted with the performers playing and singing. And they do a great job. It is a little bit of mimicry, but they do a great job. So it's kind of thrilling to see these young people embodying these roles so with such verve. The film can be two-dimensional in a lot of other ways, and again, your mileage will vary on this. When it comes to, sort of fostering a punk attitude onto the sort of events, it's really on the nose. So there's a lot of dialogue about smashing the establishment. There's a lot of dialogue about the music where it's got to kick you in the guts and punch you in the face. Oh, yeah, this kind of stuff. And they kind of overdo this. And that comes across as pretty cliche in spots. A lot of it is fictionalized, and I don't have a problem with that per se. Adaptations, I'm a great believer in adaptations kind of freely doing what they have to do to tell the story. Chrissie Hynde's relationship with Steve Jones, which I love in the series. It's really cool, and it serves as kind of one pole of the emotional heart. We have Hynde and Jones. We have this very antagonistic, but I think really well done relationship between Jones and Rotten. And then this, in the end, quite heartbreaking relationship between Jones and McDowell. But the Jones and Hynde relationship is beautifully rendered. She's like a lover for him. She's inspiration for him. She's kind of a mentor to him. And they play it really real. So she gets frustrated when he's a dickhead. He gets frustrated at her because he's jealous, because she's better than him. And one of the last scenes in the film is really him being jealous of her success, and it's sad. But much of this relationship is fictionalized. Apparently they did have a friendship. They did have some sexual encounters, but the show makes it seem like they're kind of soulmates who missed the opportunity, and it was never quite like that. Other things are kind of less important, but it's worth, look up, the differences between reality and the show. It kind of, in a way, chimes in with what I was saying in the video about, like, can we ever know the truth of the Sex Pistols? And this show is going to give some truth, but it's also going to complicate it because it tells a story that's not 100% true. Danny Boyle does some of his most, I think, kind of inspired directing in years, or since the Olympics opening ceremony. The opening scene, we get a lot of stuff in here, especially in the early episodes, about Steve Jones's thievery. And he was a kind of a thief and a burglar before he got into the Pistols. And the opening scene is when he breaks into the Hammersmith Odeon to steal some of David Bowie's gear. And we get this sort of lit up fantasy moment of Jones on stage, which is meant to be foreshadowing of, his eventual fame, but also kind of his fantasy at the time. And it's shot really well, and it's beautifully done. One of my favorite scenes comes near the end when Jones and Rotten are arguing. And Rotten has figured it out. Rotten knows that McDowell's screwing them, that he wants the band to implode, that he's purposefully engineered the American tour to fall apart and so on. And he's like, Jones, we can be a band. We can do this, but we can't do it with Malcolm. And it's a very heartbreaking scene because Jones, on the one hand, kind of believes him, but on the other hand, and the series has done a good job of making clear why Jones would feel this way. Like, he feels like he owes Malcolm. And there's this very unique kind of split screen form for the sequence where the split screen kind of seems to switch as they walk around the room, and sometimes we've got Rotten on one side and Jones on the other, and then they switch, or they walk from frame into frame, but it's split screen. It's very coolly done because it's meant to be like they're in the same room, but there's a divide there that no matter which way they go or where they go, they can't bridge that divide. And I thought that was really well done. And there are other moments like that throughout that are really kind of effective. It doesn't overdo it, but it's a joy to watch this if you can take your reservations and park them over here. One thing that I didn't love about it, although I think they kind of do their best with it, is the Sid Vicious story. And in part, that's because Sid, in the first sort of 3.5 episodes before he joins the band, is a bit player. You know, we meet him, we see that he's a face of the punk scene, and we know that he's friends with Johnny Rotten. They get a couple scenes together. We see Rotten name him Sid. And then he just kind of shows up at the end, and in the last sort of, from the middle of episode 4 to the middle of episode 6 is where we get, so like 2 eps worth, we get Sid's story. And it's again, I think, very sort of compressed and underserved. And part of that comes from the fact that for Rotten, for Jones, to a lesser extent, but still Cook, we get background, we get family scenes, we get to see kind of who these people are. But for much of the series, when Sid is there, he's just the cliche of Sid Vicious. So as he gets into his relationship with Nancy, it's well rendered, but it feels empty. And as we lead up to the tragic deaths of both of them, we're meant to understand the weight of their deaths because of the way others respond. And it felt to me like it's not enough. And that once again, Sid, this 20-year-old kid, is another punk cliche in a way. And I don't think that's what they were intending to do, but that's how it came across to me. Speaking of 20-year-old, in the end, one of the things that I think it gets really well, and that is maybe what makes it the most worth watching, is how young these guys were. It makes it clear by just how naive they are. Like they're full of hope, they're full of piss and vinegar, they don't give a shit about anybody, but they all play it, especially Wallace and Boone. They wear their emotions so close to the surface that even with all this piss and vinegar, even with all this cynicism, even with all the nastiness, we can see these wounded boys underneath. And that, I think, it does better than The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, to be sure, but The Filth and the Fury, which is more about these older men looking back on the time. And yes, in The Filth and the Fury, we get Lydon's tearful remembrance of Sid, which is very moving. But I think one of the things this series does well is capture that, their fragility. You know, they did take on the world, they did do all those things, they did sort of take these disparate punk movements and put them up in front of everyone's face. But they did so as kind of very fragile and, for some of them, damaged young men. And the series captures that really well without being on the nose with it like it is about some of the Destroy the Establishment stuff. In the end, it's really going to depend on, you know, how much can you handle the cliches? How much can you handle the Disney? Those two things aside, and some flat characters. The performances are all great. Some of the writing is a little bit flat. If you can live with that, and if you can live with this sort of compressed timeline of 4 years in 6 episodes, I didn't want to like it. I wanted to be like, this is gonna suck. But it won me over in the end because of its fidelity to the time, because of its fidelity to not just punk, but the very complex and complicated and contradictory nature of punk. It does that. It gets that. And in the end, the performances are just really fantastic. So I think it's definitely enjoyable. Is it truth? Is anything about the Sex Pistols truth besides putting on the music and listening to it? I don't know. But if you can get past those couple of things, I think it's a worthy entry into this fractured, fragmented, fractal, 50-year biographical project of trying to understand what the hell the Sex Pistols were. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter here talking about television. I'll be back with more punk cinema very soon. Until then, please keep watching movies.